Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I want to talk about reviewer spaces and author interaction in reviewer spaces, because this is a topic that comes up very, very frequently. And it seems that there is an accepted view of this, um, but quite often the view is expressed in quite simplistic terms, as if all of this is a given and it's all established and everyone knows what we're talking about. And yet, as soon as you start digging into it, it actually gets a bit more complicated, because quite often what happens is we assume that our idea and concept and understanding of the topic is the universal understanding of the topic. And that's not always the case, particularly when we consider this is usually a discussion framed about online interactions. And we all come from different cultures, different backgrounds, with different expectations, different definitions. And that can actually quite radically reshape and reframe the entire discussion. And our assumption that this is universally understood and universally understood in exactly the same way is quite often incorrect. So what I want to do is I want to go through some of the basic parameters and definitions that I'm using, how I'm framing it, because that way you know where I'm coming from. And if it's different to you, if you have a different definition, that'll show why there's a disconnect by our two different approaches. I want to talk about the rationale for this premise that authors should not be in reviewer spaces. I actually want to discuss that. Why are we doing it? I want to talk about the issue of, do we actually accept this premise? Because often it is espoused as, well, of course we accept this premise. It's a given. And yet there are some questions about that I think need to be addressed and considered. Now, it could be that we do accept the premise, but we should at least consider it, and consider it from a couple of different angles. And lastly, I want to end with some additional points to consider that can impact our decisions, can impact our thinking, and can help us arrive at different ways to achieve the goal of all of this. So, with all that being said, this isn't calling anyone out. This isn't having a go at anyone. This is just walking through my thoughts on it. So let's have a think about some of the parameters and definitions. We talk about reviewer space, and the thing is, there's a significant difference between a physical space and a virtual space. Because this idea of safe spaces, these concepts evolved to provide venues, places where difficult discourse could occur without fear of harassment. And with physical spaces, that's very easily maintained. There are entrances, there are exits, there are ways to maintain boundaries. But when we move into virtual spaces, defining those boundaries becomes a lot more difficult. Because when we think about it, how are we defining and showing that something that is virtual is a reviewer space? A YouTube page, someone's YouTube channel, looks like any other YouTube channel. There'll be different things on it, different graphics on it, but there's nothing explicit on that channel that says this is a reviewer space. It doesn't have a different border, it doesn't have a different outline, it doesn't look differently. So that YouTube channel is not advertised as a reviewer space. There's not a sign on it. Reddit is a fan community, and yet reviewers routinely publish reviews and have review discussions in a fan community. So we're already making a distinction between reviewers and fans. Goodreads is a review community, but also an author community, because we want authors to be on Goodreads because we want to see their reviews of other books, but we also want to be able to see their books. So Goodreads it's not so much a review community, even though that's a significant portion of it. It's a book community, and it's a book community to sell books. Authors, reviewers, critics, fans all interact on Goodreads. So is Goodreads in its entirety a reviewer space, or is it only part of it? So this is the difficulty in assuming, well, everyone knows what a reviewer space is. Are the fan subreddits on Reddit, are they reviewer spaces because reviewers post reviews there? Well, no, it's a fan space. Is Goodreads a review site? Well, yes, but it also actively encourages and gets authors to post there because, you click on an author and it has their book so you can go and find them because it's a book selling site that aggregates reviews. YouTube. YouTube is a vast publishing platform. And because of that, it's not a review site. A review blog is clearly marked as, book reviews. That's a review blog. That's very different to YouTube. YouTube is an entirely flexible publishing platform that covers lots of different things, not just reviews. So it's not clear that YouTube in and of itself is a review space or a reviewer space. And often the individual channels are not marked as reviewer spaces. But this even takes us on to the consideration of like, what is an author? And you're like, oh, that's really easy. An author is the person that wrote the book. But in this discussion, it's that authors should not invade or interact with reviewer spaces. So let's break that down. No author, so if you have ever written a book, you are not allowed to interact with any reviewer space. And you go, well, clearly that is too broad. That's ridiculous. Just because someone has written a book doesn't mean that they can't interact with reviews of other books. So we don't mean that no author should be in a reviewer space. We mean no author should be in the review space about their review, about their work. And that's actually a completely different thing. Usually it gets stated that authors should not be in reviewer spaces. But that's not what people mean. People mean if I review book X by author Y should not comment on the review. But author Z can comment on that review because it doesn't involve author Z. That seems to be the most logical interpretation of it, but that's never really how it's stated in a lot of the general discourse because it's simplified to authors should not be in reviewer spaces. But we also have author interviews. And we can say, oh, but there's a distinction there because that author has been invited onto the channel for an interview. You go, yeah, but that is an author being in a reviewer space. So it's not an outright ban. There's already gray areas here. There's already complication here. It's not simple or simplistic or reductive. There's a level of complexity. And let's complicate this a little further. Even if we look just at Booktube, the concept of Booktube as a community, it isn't a singular community. It is an aggregation of thousands, if not tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people talking about books. We have editors, critics, reviewers, authors, fans. Authors interact with fans. That's something we encourage. So we want authors to interact with fans. One of the great aspects of social media is the ability to have interaction. That's what we want to encourage. And a lot of fans post videos about books on Booktube, and they want author interaction. So clearly, it's not that authors aren't allowed to be on Booktube, particularly because authors are also fans and readers and consumers of books. And any rule that says that, oh, an entire segment of our community, they are not allowed to interact, that is clearly not what this is meant to be about, because that would reek of hypocrisy and gatekeeping and elitism and privilege, none of the things that the community stands for. So it's not that authors can't interact on Booktube, because authors are also readers, and Booktube is for all readers. Therefore, it is inclusive. And we can't mean that editors or critics can't also interact with authors, because editors and critics often interact with authors. Booktube isn't any one thing. It's lots of different things, and it all depends on the individual creator. So we can see how this complicates matters ever so slightly. And then we think, well, okay, authors aren't allowed to interact with a review of their work. You go, there's a very simple, clear-cut definition that everyone can get behind. It's simple, it's straightforward, it provides a clear rule. Except, what constitutes a review? Because you can have a fan discussion between multiple fans. You can have a critical essay, which isn't a review, it's critical discourse. Again, fans publish those. You can have a spoiler talk, which is a bunch of people talking about the book and interacting. That's not a review either. You can have a reading vlog, not a review. A TBR video, an update, a channel update. An unhaul, a book haul. All of these are really common videos on YouTube, specifically in the Booktube sphere. None of those are reviews. So is an author allowed to interact with those? And I think we'll find that some people say yes, and some people will say no. There's no clarity on the subject because A, we all have different channels. We're all in control of our own content. We all decide who we want to interact with and how we want to interact with them. So there's no clear consensus on that. There's also no clear consensus on what a review is. One of the reasons I know this is quite often in what is deemed a review, you will have someone saying, oh, here's an author's behaving badly video. And that's not a review of their books. That's discussing the behavior of an author. And you're like, right, but that's not a review. So why doesn't the author have a right to reply? That's specifically about author behavior. That's commentary on people's actions. That's not a review. How does that fall under this privilege of a reviewer space? Because what is a reviewer? If I have one review on my channel, does that class my entire channel as a reviewer space, and therefore no author can gainsay anything about any of my videos, because it is this sacrosanct space where I'm allowed to say what I want about any aspect of an author's life or their work or any aspect of the community without any comeback, without any pushback, that I'm entitled to say whatever I want and no one is allowed to gainsay it. You're like, well, clearly that's not, doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Because when we think about it, there's a reason for the concept of reviewer spaces. And I'm going to get into that in a minute. But when we set up that reviewers are somehow a special class that are absolutely privileged in what they say and are protected in what they say, and authors are never allowed to come back, you go, well, if you're commenting about someone's personal life, you're no longer commenting about their work. It's not a review. That's potentially an attack on a person. And why is that being protected? So let's talk about the reasons, the rationale for why authors aren't meant to be in reviewer spaces. And the big, most important one is freedom from harassment. This ties into freedom of speech, that a reviewer should be free to give a negative review of a book without fear of harassment from an aggrieved author. You go, yeah, makes perfect sense. Because we've seen a massive rise in online harassment as social media and our lives move further and further into the virtual sphere. We've seen a staggering rise in online abuse. Now, what's interesting about this entire discussion is that while there are cases of authors abusing some people online, the vast majority of online abuse actually comes from fans, not the authors. And yet we choose to focus on authors as the problem instead of the fans. The second thing is, this is often framed as a power dynamic where a reviewer does not have the power of the author. And yet, when you look at a lot of authors' profiles online, their Twitter accounts, their Facebook accounts, their Instagram accounts, a lot of these authors have far fewer followers and subscribers and supporters than a lot of the reviewers. And so we get into this tricky position where we say, well, hang on a sec. Do we now have to measure the level of following between these different people to decide who's allowed to say what? That suddenly it's not a rule anymore, it's an adjudication. And it can change day to day depending on the number of followers that someone has. The power dynamic disparity is, again, a very, very complex issue. And yet, the vast majority of times, we have seen that authors, even when they engage in bad behavior, are not setting their fans on people. That actually fans act on their own. And even when an author says, don't do that, explicitly says, do not do that, fans ignore them. That is not the author behaving badly, that's the fans behaving badly. And we know that in science fiction, in fantasy, in multiple genres, there are elements of almost every single fandom that have problems. It's not that any one fandom is really, really bad, despite what anyone says about any one particular fandom. But there are always going to be elements of that fandom that behave in ways that are inappropriate. Well, inappropriate to us. Again, we're making an assumption about cultural norms. We're making an assumption about what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable. And that is a big issue. But freedom from harassment is a major and important aspect of protecting reviewers. Freedom of speech, not so much, because the publishing platforms that we use protect what we have said. It's the harassment that is the issue, not the freedom of speech, because we're almost always free to say things and publish our reviews, our thoughts, our considerations, our critiques. We can do that because we're protected by the publishing platform, be it YouTube or Instagram or TikTok or wherever, that we can't be censored. So it's self-censorship because of fear of harassment is the issue. But if we expect authors to behave professionally, then we should also expect reviewers to behave professionally. Because if you're doing a review, maybe aspects of the author's personal life are relevant to that review of their work. It can be. It comes up. It can be very important. It can add a lot to the discussion. But we have to be very careful about how we broach it, because if we mistakenly assign something to an author, if we criticize them for something, if we state that they are or do something that's not true, then that is something that we should be corrected on, because we would be unintentionally, obviously, propagating a lie, propagating misinformation or disinformation, potentially slandering. Well, actually, because it's published material, it would be libeling. We would be defaming someone through published material, so we would be libeling someone. That's a big issue. And if people see that we do that, just as we call out authors' bad behavior, shouldn't we expect fans to call out our behavior or other people to call out our behavior? Reviewer spaces as a concept are not there to allow us to say whatever we want in whatever way we want without regard to truth. It still has to be rooted in the review. It has to be rooted in actual analysis. It has to be supported, because otherwise we're just issuing defamatory statements. And no, there's no justification for that. One of the reasons given for authors not being allowed to be in reviewer spaces is to protect the integrity of the review, because there's this fear that if authors are known to comment on positive reviews, well, reviewers are more likely to give positive reviews to get that interaction, to get that dopamine hit. I think this is a staggeringly disingenuous attack on the integrity of reviewers, given that we accept that there are reviewers who request payment to review a book. Pay me and I will review your book. You go, we accept that. And they will put the disclaimer, I was paid to do this, but I was paid to give an open and honest and forthright review. And we accept that they're not influenced by the fact that they're being paid. We also have people who receive free books, either directly from the author, from an intermediary, or from a publisher, where they get free books. And they go, I received this book in exchange for an honest review. And we accept that. And in both those circumstances, that inducement, that incitement is received before they do the review. And there is a vested interest in actually producing a good review, a positive review, so that they can keep getting paid. They can keep getting free books. But we don't question their integrity. But somehow the idea that after I have purchased a book, read it, created a review, published it, that an author might come along in the sea of reviews that are out there, out of potentially hundreds of thousands of reviews, find mine and leave a comment, that somehow is a fear. Getting free stuff isn't a fear. Getting paid to do it isn't a fear before I've done the review. But the fact that an author might, at a certain point in time, leave a positive comment, that is something to explain why authors shouldn't be in reviewer spaces. And I think we can see how ludicrous that position is. Like, that is just nonsense. We also have this idea that authors do not have the right to reply to a bad review, because reviews are for consumers. They're not for the author. But here's the thing. One of the things that we're very confident in is death of the author. My opinion matters. Not the author's intention, it's what I got from it. You're the author of a review. You publish that review. It's not yours anymore. You've put it in the public domain. You don't get to dictate who reads it and who interacts with it. Just as an author doesn't get to dictate who reads their work, interact with it, and respond to it. Your intention, just like the author's intention, is in some ways irrelevant, particularly if you hold to this hard line and extreme version of death of the author. But the idea that authors do not have a right to reply is not based in fact. Authors have always had a right to reply. There are famous literary feuds. And what's interesting about this is, well, it's not nice when an author calls us out. Sometimes we get things wrong, and an author can say, "Oh, sorry you felt that way. This section was actually cleared up in that chapter. You might have missed it." And that's not the behavior that we're complaining about. The behavior we're complaining about is authors harassing reviewers. That's not harassing reviewers. We also have some people who believe that authors should not be allowed to take screenshots or quote from and tweet about or illustrate in videos like bad reviews and make fun of them. Again, when we publish stuff and put it in the public sphere, it becomes fair game in exactly the same way that there are lots of YouTubers out there, even if it's not us personally, but there's lots of YouTubers out there who take sections of books, badly written prose, and make fun of it. We have entire subreddits about male authors who can't write female characters. And those subreddits can be, quite vitriolic. So why isn't an author allowed to make fun of a bad review? Because it might annoy the reviewer? Well, no, because that's about feelings. That's not about harassment. Because their fans might go and harass the reviewer. That's a valid concern. But again, that's an issue with fans, not authors. And in the modern day, we also expect authors and their marketing team, if they have one, or someone else, to go and find reviews to put on book blurbs and book covers. Like they have to go and find them because we're asking authors to do more and more and more about the marketing of their own books. So we know in this sphere that authors are being asked by us, by publishers, and independent and self-published authors are going out there and having to do market research themselves. So we know that they have to go and get these reviews, read through the reviews, see if they can find nice little quotations and snippets that they can put on a cover. We know that they're going to do it. And if they are not personally doing it, but quite often they have someone who's doing it on their behalf. So we know that they're going to do that. That's an expectation. And sometimes they will have to read through a review to get the sense of whether or not it's a positive review or a good review, whether there's something in it that's worthwhile, which means they have to go through the review. Because in order to drive engagement with the algorithm, in order to get the most out of people watching videos and watching reviews and reading reviews, we want people to go all the way to the end to find out what we think. So quite often, a lot of people hold off on their decisions, until the end of the video. And so up until that point, it might have been balanced. It might have been talking about one aspect and then this other aspect. And therefore, a reviewer an author would have to go all the way through to find out whether or not it was a truly negative review. Wait until the end. And again, maybe you personally don't do that, but we all know people who do. So it's not as clear cut as, well, this was clearly a negative review. Some people disguise what they think about it because it's a more clickbaity title. Find out what I think about this book. I read this book. You'll never know what I thought, to get people to watch the video. And yet an author is meant to ignore that, even though they have been told they need to get quotations from reviewers. So we know that that's an issue. And I think part of this actually comes down to establishing authority and dominance. I think in some cases, there are people who want the absolute right to say whatever they want without any repercussions and do not like being challenged on their hot takes. But we know that social media, the various algorithms that control it, have rewarded sensationalism. We know that people are being hyperbolic. We know that people exaggerate things. in order to drive engagement. And therefore, that review is now no longer honest because it's been exaggerated. They may have used clickbait. They may have used inflammatory language. They may exaggerate a lot of the aspects of it, in which case, that's something that's no longer an honest review. So once it becomes dishonest, who's allowed to call that out? And by denying authors the ability to comment on these things, we are saying, no, you're not allowed to do it. We are then becoming gatekeepers and denying access to our community, to the people who create the very things that we love. En masse, as a class, with no nuance. And that seems wrong because it's setting reviewers up as an unassailable authority. And that is not, I think, the sort of community that we want to foster. Our community is based on communication, engagement, a plethora of views, the ability to agree to disagree, to congenially discuss, and argue in the non-pejorative sense, to have completely different views on books and have fun talking about them. But if you publish a review that is framed and discussed in such a way that it is inflammatory or mean or nasty, why should you be protected from being called out? There are plenty of ways to discuss a negative review of something without being mean, nasty, or personal about the person that wrote it. Loads of different ways to do it. So why is it that in a lot of these things, people cry foul when they get called out for saying nasty things? Are we now setting up a rule to protect bullies? Because that's what a lot of these people are. I can say whatever I want about this book because if the author ever once raised a single word of objection, I can pretend to be a victim of their harassment. That is not what this is designed to protect against. And we have seen examples of people abusing that. We have on YouTube. There are multiple examples of people doing that. But that's not who we call out here. The vast majority of the harassment we see on YouTube is not from authors, it's from fans. But that's not who we are calling out here. So the very rationale for this premise is not as accepted and as concrete and as definitive and as unassailable as I have seen a number of people present it. It's a lot more complicated than that. So when we talk about whether or not we're going to accept this premise that authors should not be in reviewer spaces, one of the first things to remember is there is no historical justification for this. Authors and reviewers, authors and critics have always been in dialogue. There are famous letters written to newspapers where a review appeared, backwards and forwards. There are flame wars. Before the internet, there were flame wars between authors and reviewers. But added to this, a lot of authors are also reviewers, critics, and editors. And so there's a very famous one of Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain, criticizing the Last of the Mohican books. It is an absolutely eviscerating review. You should go and read it to see how to create an entirely negative review that is brilliantly witty. It is cutting. It is negative, but it is not mean and nasty. But we all know that the author on the receiving end of that was perfectly entitled to respond. And you go, oh, but Twain was an author. You go, but he was also a reviewer. Dickens was a reviewer and a critic. Lots of people hold multiple roles. Authors can be readers and fans and critics and reviewers and editors. It's not that when you become a reviewer, all else falls away. So there's no historical justification for this. There has always been interplay between the two. If someone publishes a review, quite often an author will write to the editor of that publication for a right to reply. We have enshrined the right to reply against accusations. That's the historical precedent that is set. So this idea that authors have never been able to do it is entirely false. The second thing is this sort of cultural justification, this idea that authors shouldn't do this. This is a known rule in the culture. What culture? And this is another big issue. There are massive assumptions being made about the culture of this entire interaction. When we have authors from all over the world, reviewers from all over the world, fans from all over the world of different ages, different backgrounds, to assume that any one culture is the one that gets to decide this because that's the default where we are from is the height of arrogance and hubris, and is asserting a level of privilege about what is right based on what we personally are comfortable with. And that's not how a community works. So when we think about this banning of authors in reviewer spaces, it's clear that the vast majority of the time it's not the author that's the problem, it's the fans, or at least some of the fans. That a lot of reviewers are complaining about interactions on things that aren't reviews, and yet somehow the author, like any other viewer or any other reader, is meant to intuit that the entirety of a channel is a reviewer space, even when that person may have a whole host of other videos which are not reviews. And they're asserting a blanket privilege over all of their material as if they have some get out of jail free card. And, you know, that's clearly wrong. So we're punishing authors and punishing fans because we're saying that authors aren't allowed to interact on reviews, but this is having severe and significant impacts in fan communities because they're in the self-same sphere. Their channels look the same. Their Reddit posts look the same. So we are scaring off authors from interacting with their fans by insisting that authors do not interact with reviewers, that authors don't intrude in reviewer spaces. And yet we never take the opportunity to clearly signal that something is a reviewer space. And I know someone's going to say, oh, but I recorded a video on this. You go, okay, so if you recorded a video on this year, last year, 2 years ago, where does that appear on your feed? Where does that appear on your channel? Is it the one that's bookmarked at the very top that's usually a trailer for your channel? Is that where you outline that this is a reviewer space? Is it clearly marked that it's a reviewer space? Does it say it in your channel, on your banner? This is a reviewer space. Authors not welcome. Asterisks. Well, some are, but it depends, and I'm not going to tell you the rules in advance. Do you see how that is not an effective remedy? When the behavior we're worried about is actually fans, blaming the author is unfair. We're blaming the wrong party. When we are asserting a special status for our channel, but we're not signaling in any clear or unambiguous way what that status is, we're expecting people to intuit it. When we might have done a video a year ago, 12 months ago, and we have 500 videos on our channel, how is someone on clicking on a new channel meant to be able to find that video, to know what our stance is on reviewer spaces. These are things that sometimes we don't even think about because we know what we think. And we think that it's universal and therefore everyone understands this. But this is about the interaction with people who don't know us, who are strangers to us, who may be strangers to our culture, who may have found our channel for the first time. How are they meant to know what our stance is on this? And why are we blaming authors for the bad behavior of some members of their fandom? And why are we blaming entire fandoms for what we know are the actions of a minority? And how often is even the impression of a fandom skewed by our bias towards that fandom? Because if we're not part of it, we tend to see it externally and we see the loudest voices, or we hear about the most outlandish or the most noteworthy stories, which are usually the ones at the extremes. We don't hear about all of the positive interactions usually because no one trumpets about positive interactions. It's only the things that bug us or the things that we've been told have bugged other people. So even our impression of fandoms is usually skewed and not based in any rational fact. But let's talk about some points to consider that can help with this situation. And the first is, people often refer to the unwritten rules of the netiquette of all of this. Well, for a start, one of the easiest things to do is write them down. Unwritten rules are subject to individual variance and change over time, and no one knows because they're unwritten. It's just assumed. And when we assume things like this, we are forgetting that people are from different cultures, different backgrounds, have different experiences, and therefore their assumptions could be radically different to ours. So the easiest way is write them down. If you want a netiquette policy for your individual channel, put it in your about page. Have something that says, please read my netiquette on my about page. Have it a little tagline on your banner. We can agree that if you, and I've heard some people say this, if you want authors to interact with you, you should signal this to the authors. You're like, no, the base agreement we all have are the terms and conditions of the use of the service, i.e. YouTube. If someone wants to alter that, they are the ones that have to advertise that they are applying additional rules, because it is only fair to assume that someone who signs up to use YouTube, to sign up to be allowed to comment on things, is abiding by the rules of YouTube, because it's that publishing platform. If we have individual rules for our individual channels that are going to modify behavior in addition to those terms of service, then it's on us to advertise that, not expect other people to do that work for us and assume that we are the default norm. Again, slightly arrogant, slightly hubristic to assume that one small part of YouTube gets to dictate the rules for every other part of YouTube. And even in that one small part, that reviewers who are dedicated reviewers get to dictate everyone's behavior across the whole of the Booktube sphere, even when they're not reviewers. No, that is absolutely unfair. And we know it's unfair. And if we're going to alter the terms of service for interaction on our particular channels, it is up to us to advertise that, to make it clear. And we can't have ambiguous things like no authors are allowed to interact on this channel, because then someone's going to point and go, but so-and-so is an author. You had them interacting on the channel. Oh, but that was on a different video that had nothing to do with their book. You go, that's not the rule then. The rule is authors are not allowed to interact on videos about their books. And again, we have to be specific. If you want people to have a code of behavior, it can't be ambiguous. We have to be clear. Now, one of the big things that I have some minor experience of is when you've talked about something and fans of that thing have gotten very annoyed, and they do, they leave horrible comments. And it's miserable. It's horrendous. People have said some truly awful things about me. And it's up to me to allow comments on that video. I can turn the comments off. That's going to hurt the video's ratings, though, but that's a choice I'm making. So I can leave the comments on. I can delete those comments. I can ban the person that did that. These are all remedies that are open to me because I can block people from my channel. Everyone has that ability. And it means then that that person will never be able to comment on videos again. That is something that is in my power and my control. So rather than expecting other people to modify their behavior, I can use my power over my channel to only have the things on it that I want. I can curate the comment section. I don't have to leave them. And if we leave them on the channel, again, it's not an endorsement of the thing, but it's a choice that we make because we can go through and delete the things. We can mute people. We can block people. We can increase the filter to catch comments, and it will catch more and more and more of them. Now, it'll catch innocent ones as well, but that's one of the tools available to us. That doesn't involve saying to an entire segment of our community who are really important to our community, you're not allowed to come in here and talk to us. We can punish the bad actors without punishing people who are perfectly innocent. And that to me seems a very useful tool to use, particularly in this circumstance. There is a big issue, and I referred to it earlier, and that's defamation and libel. The concept of a reviewer space does not protect us from a legal case. And while libel laws will differ according to various countries, it's usually better to err on the side of caution. And it's one of the things that when we review, and having done it for actual publications, that you have to be very careful about what you say about the author. Because when you review, you're reviewing a book. And if you want to gossip about an author, if you want to talk about an author's personal life, it is always important to remember we are publishing this material. YouTube is a publishing platform, and we have published that material. And that takes any potential defamatory statement and opens it up for libel. And we have to be very careful about that. And that's something I think reviewers and fans need to be a lot more cognizant of, because it is only by the grace of a lot of very forgiving authors that a bunch of us have not been sued. But the thing about this is, we know that there are a lot of YouTubers out there who have said horrendous things about actual people, about authors. And they feel perfectly justified in doing it. And if an author tried to argue back, it's, how dare you do that? I'm a reviewer. This is a review space. You weren't reviewing a book. Not all of your speech is protected. And certainly defamatory speech is not protected at all. So we have to be very aware of that. And the last thing is that death of the author comment that I made earlier. We are the authors of reviews. We are the authors of material that we have published online. As such, just as we say about authors who publish a book, we've put it out there for public consumption. And once it's out there, you don't have control of it anymore. And the thing is, we actually have far more control of our content than authors do. We can moderate the comment section. Authors, we are saying, are not allowed that opportunity to moderate or comment on reviews. So it's a case that could very easily be constructed as rules for thee, but not for me. That reviewers are somehow special We're allowed to author things that affect people. Those people are not allowed to comment. And you can see that that's a very bad look for us, particularly when so much of what we want to share about books is a love of reading, a love of story, to build these communities where we come together. And excluding people seems the opposite of that. Once we've published something, it's out in public. If we don't want authors to see it, we can limit who sees it. Publish it only to your Patreons, to your Ko-Fi subscribers. Make it private. Put the link up in your Discord. There are all sorts of ways that you can stop the general public seeing your reviews. But again, I think most people don't want to do that for their videos. They want their videos to do well, for more people to see them, to generate potentially more ad revenue. That's what people want. That's a choice. And with that choice comes the fact that it is now available to the public, like any other publicly published material. We don't get to have a special case here. So I think there are definite issues with this. And with all of these things, it is an evolving area as we learn to negotiate, as we grow and we develop etiquette and rules and terms and conditions and all of these sorts of things. It evolves over time. This is a relatively new sphere of communication. And it is taking a while to get things grounded. But insisting that unwritten rules that are unclear and that are ambiguous and that are idiosyncratically applied, that people should be bound by this, that's not the way forward. If we have altered the terms and conditions and usage agreement for YouTube because we want a different policy in place, like any organization, that policy has to be front and center. It has to be clear and unambiguous. It has to be easily accessible. It can't be something tucked away in the back, buried under 200, 300, 500 videos. It has to be upfront because people have to know what they are signing up for. And we can't expect social norms or cultural norms from where we are to translate universally. That's a really colonialist attitude. But at the same time, we want people to be safe. We want people to be protected. But if we're going to do that, then we actually have to enforce it against the bad actors, not the easy people to target. Authors are far easier to target than the bad actors within their fandoms. That doesn't mean we should target and single out the authors. It's not their fault. As we keep saying, they published it. It doesn't belong to them anymore. The fans have taken it. The readers have taken it. They've done with it what they will. It's outside of the author's control. Right? So they have no control over this anymore. And even when they tell their fans, don't do something, there'll be a segment of the fans, A, won't hear that or won't see it, or will just ignore it because they are offended on behalf of the author. There was a very recent case of a very high profile fantasy author had a negative article appear about him in a popular nerdy publication. That author went out of his way to publish a response to this in the subreddit dedicated to his books. And in that response, he said, do not take it out on this reporter. How much are you willing to bet that all of his fans listen to him? Or how much are you willing to bet that a bunch of people, ostensibly fans of his, sent rude or abusive messages to the publication, to the reporter, or made videos that made rude remarks about this person, that speculated on aspects of their private life without ever having met this person, that published videos saying very mean and nasty things about the person, not the article. I know which one is the safer bet, and unfortunately, that's a bit depressing. But if that is one of the biggest, most powerful authors in this particular subgenre explicitly saying, don't do something, and some of their fans ignored that, saying that that author shouldn't be allowed in a reviewer space because their fans might behave badly, that's blaming the wrong person. Because the author didn't attack their reviewer. Although it was a very interesting and well-polished response. But anyway, I hope this has added some context to this discussion. And the thing is, it's not the be-all and end-all of this discussion. This is an evolving conversation. It involves people from different cultures, different places, different backgrounds, with different expectations, with different ideas about what a reviewer is, or what a review is, or what a reviewer space is, what a fan space is, what an author space is. These are not agreed upon definitions and spaces. There is massive overlap. There's massive ambiguity. And there's massive amounts of personal interpretation and application of these apparent unwritten rules. And with that level of ambiguity, we cannot expect people to be mind readers. We can't expect people to know that one YouTuber defines a TBR video as a review space, and another YouTuber defines a community discussion about an author's behavior as a reviewer discussion. Because isn't that a community discussion? And authors are part of our community because they're also readers. They may also be reviewers. People have multiple roles. People wear multiple hats. Channels evolve and change over time. Channels have wide varieties of content and intention in what they're trying to do and how they share it and who they interact with. And that's why there are basic terms of service that we all agree to use YouTube. That is the default, the written rules. If we want to alter that, that's up to us individually to make sure our alterations are clear and unambiguous. Anyway, I hope that no one takes this as a personal attack. I hope that no one takes this as me castigating them. This is genuinely wanting the best, safest, most wonderful book community around, to be part of that community. But if we want to have community rules and community standards, they have to be agreed by the community, not by some people in the community who've just decided to make them up. And given that Booktube is so diverse, far-ranging, wide-ranging, made up of people who have never heard of each other. You think of the most famous booktuber that you know, who has the biggest channel that you know, and if you go to a different part of Booktube, they may never have heard of them because they follow a completely different group. They are in a different community. Booktube is not a single community. lots of different communities. And those communities are made up of lots of different peoples: fans, reviewers, critics, authors, editors, publishers, publicists, marketers, readers of all kinds. It is going to be very difficult to create a set of rules that apply to everyone and expect other people to follow them when they have never signed up for it. Think how you would feel if someone you didn't know said, by the way, these are the rules of this community. You must follow them. And you don't know who this person is. You go, but hang on, I never signed up for that. I signed up for YouTube. Who are you to dictate to me how to run my channel? Well, if you're not going to follow our rules, then you have to declare that. You go, no, if you're altering the rules of YouTube interaction, that's up to you to declare. But these are just my thoughts on it. I'm sure things will evolve over time. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and I'll see you in the next one.